In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, into space. This success for the Soviets was seen as a failure of the Americans. Our U.S. leaders blamed the lack of space success on our school systems. Our nation's leaders maintained the idea that our progressive schooling de-emphasized intellectual values like math, science, and foreign languages. Due to their perceived inadequacies of the progressive education, they began to change education in America. During the post-war era of the 1950s, our schools were in competition with the Soviets, driven by the space race. During this time, schools' purpose was to try to educate the best scientists and engineers for development of military technology. This mindset led to the National Defense Education Act of 1958. The federal government spent millions on materials, new equipment, and research centers. During the post-war era, schools also saw the beginning of desegregation. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court rejected the separate but equal doctrine during the trial of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. However, the desegregation was a slow process. Some districts desegregated peacefully, but others protested with rallies, boycotts, and violence. Therefore, white students continued to receive a good education, while many African Americans were still forced to remain in underfunded schools. The 1960s were known as the War on Poverty, initiated by the Kennedy administration. The goal of education was to end the cycle of generational poverty. During this era, methods, materials, and programs such as unsubsidized breakfast and lunch programs, Head Start, Upward Bound, and the Job Corps were created to aid disadvantaged and impoverished children. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was initiated in 1965 under President Johnson. This act allocates funds based upon the number of poor children in school districts. This allows schools to receive the added support they need to accommodate low-income families. The 1970s began with low academic performance, drops in enrollment, and academic confidence. This dramatic drop in performance caused many to start homeschooling because parents felt they could not trust teachers and schools to adequately teach their children. This crisis caused parents whose kids remained in public schools to push for the switch to the essentialist philosophy with an emphasis on back-to-the-basics curriculum and teacher accountability. The 1970s was not all bad, however. This era led to a demand for equality. Title IX of Education Amendments Act of 1975, which protects equality for all on the basis of sex in educational programs and activities, was founded. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act was also debuted in 1975. This act guarantees that children with special needs will receive a free, appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. The 80s were a continuation of the harsh reputation the 70s introduced. The 80s is often referred to as the teacher bashing era. The 80s was also an era of educational reform. It was a widely accepted fact that schools were failing to achieve their goals. Therefore, innovative minds spent the 80s suggesting solutions to this era. Some of these proposals included Mortimer Adler's Padilla proposal in 1982 and Ernest Boyer's High School, a report on secondary education in America in 1983. The educational reform that began in the 80s continued into the 90s with an emphasis on teaching. Teachers became leaders in the wake of challenges. Teachers were faced with a greater diversity, greater international competition, less support for public education, and decentralization of schools. Despite facing these many problems, teachers created innovative solutions and changed the nature of their profession as a result. In summary, the post-war era of education was a time of great change for our school systems. Our U.S. leaders recognized the importance of school and adapted curriculum to suit the purpose of protecting our country. As Vice Admiral H.G. Rickover said, "Education is our first line of defense." The new curriculum stressed that math, science, and foreign language in an attempt to fund a generation of engineers and scientists. However, this curriculum lacked humanities, arts, and English language components. These influential U.S. leaders also caused schools to transition from a progressive philosophy to an essentialist approach on education. In turn, this caused teachers to focus on content needed to be productive in society. Teachers assumed the role of authority figures to focus on proven instructional techniques and to become experts on content knowledge. Students were also forced to become distinctive learners. Schools emphasized the students' ability to use their senses to observe and measure the physical world. This era also expanded who was taught. As always, the rich white were educated, but for the first time, equality was sought for African American students, low-income students, disabled students, and female students. Although it took many years for society to become accustomed to these new acts, it was this era that was the stepping stone for our schools we know today.